Hello everyone and welcome back to Practical Web Components Quickly. A quick recap, we finished the section 1, building our first web component where we created a simple yet cool web component called block cards. Let's kickstart the next part of our journey with section 2, adding dynamism to our web components. We will begin with Web Components Lifecycle. Now a simple analogy for every web component's lifecycle is the lifecycle of humans or any living being for that instance. We take birth, we live our life, and we die. Similarly, web components are inserted into the DOM, which is birth. They are updated when a UI element is triggered, which is their life. And finally, they are deleted from the DOM, which is death. In between the birth and the death, a web component possesses a plethora of methods called lifecycle methods or lifecycle hooks, which can be implemented to make the web components more useful. Let's have a quick look at all the different lifecycle methods that a web component possesses. There's a constructor, connected callback, a disconnected callback, attribute changed callback, and an adopted callback. Now, we will be looking at all 5 of these methods throughout this video and the next one. If you remember our code, we have already implemented the constructor and the connected callback method. In fact, we have also introduced a new method called as render inside connected callback. So let's have a quick look at what are the different methods and what is the importance of each method in the lifecycle of a web component. So in this video, we will be looking at the first 3 lifecycle methods, constructor, connected callback, and disconnected callback, and we'll be picking up the next 2 methods, attribute changed callback and adopted callback, in the next video. And let's quickly look at what is the constructor method. So in our constructor method, we had called a super function and we have attached a shadow. So let's go ahead and look at the definition. Constructor is basically used for creating an instance of the shadow DOM like we have done in our code. It is used to set up event listeners and initializing a component state. Constructor is not recommended to use for executing tasks, rendering, or fetching resources. As you can see in our code, the entire rendering part, although we have created a different function called as render, we have moved the entire rendering part inside connected callback. So that's why constructor is not recommended to use for executing tasks, as its simple job is to set up everything. Next point is that it is mandatory to use a constructor. Now remember, in our web component, we make use of custom elements. And because it's a custom element, we obviously need to set it up because it's custom. That's why for a custom element, it is mandatory to have a constructor. Now let's look at some of the rules which are important for constructor. First rule is that it's forbidden to use return statement and document.write or document.open inside a constructor. Next, children should not be accessed because, well, they are not created. Like, constructor's main job is to set up. It is the first step, it is the first method which is created or which is used when a web component is created. So obviously the children element of that particular web component are not created. That's why children should not be accessed because they are not created. Now that we've had a look at the first lifecycle method, which is constructor, let's go on to the next lifecycle method, which is connected callback. For connected callback, when an element is added to the DOM, this method is triggered. We can do the following in connected callback. We can set attributes, we can fetch resources, we can run setup code, and we can render templates. Now, there's a difference between running setup code in connected callback and setting up resources in constructor. In connected callback, we will be setting up code for rendering, while in constructor, we will be setting up resources which will be used by the connected callback for rendering. So that is the difference between connected callback and constructor. We have used connected callback for rendering the template. As we will go further into our application, we will be using it for setting attributes and for fetching resources. Finally, let's look at the third lifecycle method, which is disconnected callback. Disconnected callback is basically called when an element is removed from the DOM. So we can do the following in disconnected callback. In fact, we should do the following in disconnected callback. We should be notifying other parts of the application that the element is being removed. We should unsubscribe from the DOM events. And we should stop the interval timers. And finally, we should unregister all registered callbacks. Using disconnected callback is not a mandatory process, but as a good practice, we should always consider adding disconnected callback to our code. So let's quickly go back to our code and add this particular function. Let me just add a console.log now, because as you can see, disconnected callback is used for notifying. Since we do not have other parts of the application right now, we don't need to notify others. Again, we do not have any DOM events, so we don't need to subscribe, nor do we have any interval timers. So we will just go back and add a simple message called disconnected. And we will call disconnected callback by basically deleting the element. So we do document.query selector. Thereby disconnecting the component from the DOM. With this, let's quickly go back to our index.html. So as you can see, when we added a debugger, we see that the elements are created before moving on to remove and then hitting our disconnected callback. So in our case, we don't really need to use disconnected callback unless if you want to do any of these particular events. So in our case, this was just to show you an example of what and how a disconnected callback would be called and at what junction in the life cycle of a web component. So I'll quickly remove this, save it, go back to our code and hit refresh. And there we have our application again.